Hello, my name is Marianne Foster. The way this guided tour works is like this. I'll be giving you instructions about where to go and when to stop, and my colleague John Grundy will tell you interesting information while you're on the road. Most of the time he'll tell you things before you reach them, leaving you to stop and look as often as you wish. The disc is divided into tracks so you can stop or pause it after each section and start again as you start off on the next bit of the drive. This trip starts at Corbridge and heads north to Kielder, high up near the headwaters of the North Tyne, before ending at the country town of Bellingham. It's a trip of some 70 or 80 miles, and it'll take you into some splendidly wild country on splendidly empty roads, where filling stations are few and far between. Petrol is available in Corbridge and at Chollerford, about 7 or 8 miles after you set off. After that, you won't see another garage until you reach Bellingham late in the trip, so be prepared. When you're ready to go, leave Corbridge and head north on the A68. The road will take you first of all under the A69 dual carriageway and then out into the country. This first section of the drive follows the A68 for about 3 miles, until the roundabout by the Errington Arms pub on the military road, the B6318. So, find the A68 and head north towards Otterburn and Jedburgh. Switch off or pause now, and when you're on your way, move on to track 2 to meet John Grundy. Track 2.
I get depressed very easily, and there's few things more calculated to cast me into despair than the need to tell people to drive past wonderful places without stopping. But that's what I'm going to do now. As you climb the hill north of Corbridge, it's called Stagshaw Bank incidentally, there are fabulous things to right and left. Off to the right there are 2 castles, Aden Castle and Halton Castle, which many a castle lover would pogo stick 50 miles to see. Along the lanes to the left is a charming, sylvan landscape dotted with 19th century country houses. But you have no time for such seductions. You have work to do. You must get some miles under your belt before you can stop. For hundreds of years, Stagshaw Bank was the scene of important agricultural fairs. I think there were 5 or 6 of them a year. I know there was a cattle and sheep fair in May and another for horses in July. Until the end of the 1800s, beasts would be driven huge distances to be sold here. I read an account of one farmer in the 1870s who would drive his cattle from Galloway in southwest Scotland. And when I say drive, I'm not talking about the nice, comfy experience that you're having. It meant driving them along the vast network of drove roads that crisscrossed the northern moors until they reached here. Now, that's not unlike what we're going to suggest you do. You don't need any cows or sheep with you. Indeed, I would recommend that you leave any cows or sheep behind. But we are going to take you on a route that crisscrosses the northern fells. This part of Northumberland is one of the wildest and emptiest bits of the country, and so by the end of the journey you're going to be scratching your head in a puzzled manner and saying, I thought England was supposed to be crowded.
Soon you'll come to a pub called the Errington Arms beside a roundabout. Turn left at the roundabout onto the B6318, which is also known as the military road. You can switch off or pause now and switch back on to track 3 when you've turned left. Track 3. You should now be on the B6318, the military road. Continue west on this road for about 3 miles until you start going down a long hill. Just after you pass the St Oswald's Tea Room, you'll see a wooden cross on the right. There's a lay-by beside the cross where you can stop.
You've probably noticed the abandoned farmstead on the right. Everybody who's ever driven up this road, I don't think I'm exaggerating here, everybody has fantasised about turning that building into a country cottage, because this is what Northumberland is all about. Emptiness and wildness, rough moorland and big skies. The road is known as the Military Road because of Bonnie Prince Charlie, who landed in Scotland in 1745 to try and regain his rightful position on the throne. He gathered an army and he set off south to conquer England. Everybody assumed that he'd come down the east coast, so the English army was in Newcastle, but Charles, the cunning little prince, came via Carlisle instead. The English tried to cut him off, but the roads were such rubbish that they couldn't make it in time, and the Scots sneakily bypassed the English defences. The rebellion failed eventually, and the following year they built this road to make sure the situation would never happen again. This section is built on top of the Roman wall. They just widened it a bit and turned it into a road. It's down there still. You're driving on the Roman wall. You should trade your car in for a chariot. In lots of places you should be able to see Roman ditches and earthworks on both sides, because the Romans didn't just build a wall, they created a whole military zone, a bit like the Berlin Wall. Imagine how impressive it must have been. 20 feet high and 84 miles long. Somebody wrote that it must have looked as alien in this landscape as a motorway would have looked in 19th century Africa. There's one more thing to see before we turn off the military road. On the long hill just after the St Oswald's Tea Room, you'll come across a tall wooden cross. This marks the site of the Battle of Heavenfield, in which Oswald, the Christian king of Northumbria, defeated his pagan rival Cadwallon, the king of Gwynedd. If you've got the energy, it's worth strolling up to the church on the hillside that marks the actual battle site. You could try to visualise it as it was on that day in 635 AD. The hillside was the battlefield, the road was the Roman wall, of course, still a full 20 feet in height. The church wouldn't have been there. It's not very old, but it's full of atmosphere and there's a little exhibition. And if that's not enough to tempt you up the hill, there's a gorgeous view to the north from the churchyard.
OK, pause or switch off now, and when you're leaving Heavenfield, switch back on again to track 4. Track 4. Keep going down the hill straight over the crossroads and then continue through the traffic lights and cross the bridge over the River Tyne. At the roundabout after the bridge, ignore the turning left following the Roman wall and instead head straight on up the hill on the B6320, which is signposted towards Jedburgh, Bellingham and Kielder water.
At Corbridge, where we started off, you were beside the River Tyne. As you come to the bottom of this long and wonderful hill, you'll be back at the Tyne again, except that by now it's called the North Tyne, and that's because beyond Hexham the Tyne branches, and the South Tyne wanders off into the beautiful countryside of the Northern Pennines. The North Tyne starts in this glorious pastoral countryside that should be around you now. At the bottom of the hill is Chollerford, which is replete with interest. The house on the right, just before the bridge, was a railway station until the 1950s, and it must have been one of the first abandoned stations to be converted into a house. I seem to have been admiring it for at least 40 years. The bridge itself was built in 1785 as a replacement for one that was swept away by a terrible flood in 1771. Every bridge on the whole Tyne was washed away, except for the one at Corbridge. At Newcastle there were even tales of a baby washed away from a house built on the bridge, being picked up safe and well in its cradle several miles out to sea. North of the bridge is the George Hotel. In the 1960s, the great American novelist John Steinbeck had 2 holidays there. He came with his wife, and he only had nice things to say about it. I've never stayed there myself, but it looks nice, and the setting, well, what can you say? It is very pretty. Remember that after the bridge you need to go straight ahead at the roundabout, heading north along the valley of the North Tyne, towards Bellingham and eventually Kielder. For the time being, though, you're only going to follow the river as far as the village of Simonburn. The landscape around you now might look gentle enough, but remember that you're heading north into the territory of the people that Hadrian described as barbarians. So be afraid, be very afraid. Or not. To be honest, you might meet a few sheep with a mean look in their eyes on this trip, but on the whole, the people are pretty civilised nowadays. It didn't used to be like that. We're heading by a rather roundabout route for Kielder, which is a vast man-made lake nowadays. But in the 1700s, long before the upper valley was flooded, Kielder belonged to the first Duke of Northumberland, and he built a hunting lodge there called Kielder Castle. It was in an isolated area just a few miles from the Scottish border, and he described the tenants on his estate as quite wild. There were half-naked women chanting a wild measure, while the men, brandishing dirks, danced a war dance. Now, clearly you'll be keeping an eye out for those half-naked women, but my experience is that they're few and far between nowadays. There are just too many midges to make it worth the effort of taking your clothes off, while the men on the whole have abandoned dirks in favour of iPods and mobile phones. But you never know. There may still be the odd dirk brandisher and scantily clad maiden. One can but dream, and certainly the landscapes that we're heading for, the emptiness and the bleakness, will act as a reminder of those wild days. Before we hit the moors proper, there is one tiny little detour that you might enjoy. It involves turning off into the village of Simonburn, where there's a pretty fine church by Northumberland standards, a really fine vicarage by any standards you might apply. There are a couple of rows of characteristic Northumbrian cottages, and there's a sweet tea room, especially sweet on those fine days when you can sit out and drink your tea in the little front garden. The church is ancient. It's named after St Mungo, which was a sort of nickname for an early Scottish saint called St Kentigern, and the dedication suggests that it was Kentigern who founded the church way back in the 6th century. In the porch there's a fragment of an excellent Anglo-Saxon cross, which is further proof that it really is very old. Most of what you'll see, though, dates from the 13th century, and it's actually full of nice things. There's splendid Victorian stained glass by a man called C.E. Kemp, who was among the best of all the 19th century glass designers. His drawing is delicate and refined, and his colours are always dominated by gold, and the effect can be magical. There's also a terrific gravestone on the floor near the chancel to the mother of one of the vicars. In a complicated way, it traces her lineage from a lady called Antonia Barlow, who was one of 5 sisters who all married bishops. You wonder whether they did it on a bet. It must have been a rare challenge for number 5 to keep the record going. The vicarage is a fantastic piece of architecture. It's early 18th century in what you would call the Baroque style, which means, I suppose, that there's a bit too much decoration for the space available. All of the windows are sort of scrunched together and have heavy stone surrounds. But there is one thing that sadly you can't see. But in the vicarage garden there is a privy. Now, the unusual thing about this privy is that it's got 3 seats in a row, 3 wooden seats, 2 for adults and a little one for a child. Whether the whole family went out together for a bit of a ponder, or whether they just had several seats to spread the load, as it were, I don't know. I'm not sure I want to know, but it does stir my febrile imagination.
In a mile or so you'll arrive at the turn-off to Simonburn. You'll see signposts to the village shop and tea room and to St Mungo's 13th century church. The village is just about half a mile from the main road, and there's a little car park beside the church. Move on to the next track when you're ready to leave Simonburn. Track 5. Right, time to move on, so first of all leave Simonburn the way you came in.
Like many Northumbrian villages, Simonburn is really an estate village. In the church you might have seen references to the Allgood family, who owned most of the things round here. In a moment or two you'll see the gates to Nunnick Hall, their family home, And the rather splendid Townhead farm, which you'll also pass, was the estate's home farm.
When you get back to the main road, turn left and then immediately left again, following signs to Stonehaugh. When you're on the road to Stonehaugh, move on to the next track. Track 6. This road's known locally as Ward Lane, and you should continue on it until you reach Stonehaugh in 6 miles' time. The road's a national cycle route in places, and there's likely to be farm traffic, and you might meet logging trucks. It's also quite a narrow road in places, so you'll need to watch out for one of the many designated passing places when traffic's approaching you. In a few miles' time, you'll enter the forest, and shortly after that you'll need to turn off to the right towards Stonehaugh. The way is clearly marked.
This ridge that you're climbing now lifts you quite rapidly a good 600 feet above the valley floor, and you're leaving the relatively gentle pastoral landscape behind. Who needs pastoral landscape? You can see pastoral landscapes anywhere. This is Northumberland. You're approaching the real Northumberland, the emptiness and the big skies. I hope you've had a nice time so far, but you have at last left the main roads and the valley behind. For the next 15 miles or so you'll be up in the hills, and things should become pretty quiet. But not, in my opinion, merely pretty. This landscape has an odd sort of beauty. My background is Cumbrian, and my early experiences of countryside were in the Lake District, with its mighty crags and precipitous valleys. And when I first came here, it took me quite a while to start appreciating the less dramatic wildness of the northeast. I appreciate it now, though. I can't imagine anywhere more beautiful. There might not be any mighty mountains in Northumberland, but the border hills seem to roll on forever, ridge after ridge after ridge. For a little while the ridge you're on is lined, or partly lined, with trees and little blocks of commercial woodland. But as you leave the trees behind, you'll soon begin to catch glimpses of the wider landscape. To the south of you, the moors stretch back to the Roman wall, across a little-known and little-visited landscape. To the north, the hills just seem to go on forever. It's a big county, Northumberland. I believe it's the 5th biggest in England, but in comparison to the size, its population is tiny, and most of them live on Tyneside. Out here, on the northwestern edge of the county, there are more sheep than people, and the emptiness can feel quite profound. However, this high, empty and wild landscape is not quite what it seems. It looks simple, it looks big and empty, and it's difficult to imagine that it's ever been anything different, but the story is quite a bit more complicated. In the distant past, for example, in the years after the last ice age, about 10,000 years ago, the landscape was covered with forest, and the first humans who settled here were hunter-gatherers in the forest. But gradually, from about 5,000 years ago, humans have been settling here, cutting down the trees, planting crops and raising stock. And by the time the Romans arrived, the hills were quite a bit busier than they are now. I remember talking to one landowner close to here, and he told me that there were hundreds of prehistoric sites that had already been recorded by archaeologists on his land, but that he had ridden over every inch of his estate on horseback, and he reckoned that not 1 in 10 had so far been identified. He was convinced that his moors must have been quite densely populated back in the Bronze Age. Some of the ancient sites are around you now. Quite soon, possibly even as we speak, you'll pass a dramatic set of crags called Ravensheugh Crags on the left-hand side of the road. Beside them is a little group of 4 standing stones. They were the base of a Bronze Age burial cairn, 2,500 years old. But one of the stones is older still. It's covered with cup and ring markings, which are thousands of years older even than the Bronze Age. It was carved in the Stone Age, probably reused by the Bronze Age builders because of its ancient religious significance. So, the wild emptiness that you see now isn't natural. It's the product of thousands of years of man's interaction with the landscape. And of course, as you should see quite soon, the interaction is still going on. In fact, recently it's been going in the opposite direction. Because on this section of the trip you will be entering a new forest, a man-made forest, the Kielder forest, or initially at least a bit of it, which is called the Wark forest. Before you enter it you'll catch glimpses of its size, great dense blocks of green rolling off into the distance. It all belongs to the Forestry Commission, which was set up in 1919, just after the First World War, to try and stop the country being too dependent on imports for its vital supplies of timber. The forests up here in North Tyne weren't begun until the 1920s, and in fact the major development started after 1930, when the 8th Duke of Northumberland died, and the government took his estates up here in lieu of death duties. Since then, they've created the largest man-made forest in Europe, with apparently 150 million trees, give or take one or two. The sort of traditional view of the Forestry Commission is that they planted vast, dense stands of dark imported conifer trees like Sitka spruce, and you'll still see plenty of that sort of planting. Right from the start of entering the forest there's planting like that. But in more recent years the situation has begun to change. And you'll see the changes too as you approach Stonehaugh. The Commission has embraced biodiversity as a concept, for example, so there are far more native species of tree being planted, and trees which create suitable habitats for wildlife. They also harvest the trees differently. Before, everything was planted at the same time, and 45 years later it was all cleared at the same time. The stumps would be left to rot, and the cycle would begin all over again. Wildlife can't settle in conditions like that, and it looks ugly too. So nowadays there's far more of what you might call silviculture, tree management, so that individual trees are selected for felling under continuous cover, which allows for much more continuity of the habitat and creates much more attractive places for humans to enjoy as well, because human recreation has become another big theme in the forest. But maybe we'll come back to that a bit more when we get nearer to Kielder. Before that, you'll get to the village of Stonehaugh, which is an odd place. It's like a 1950s housing estate in the forest. Well, in fact, what it is a 1950s housing estate in the forest. It was designed by an extremely influential mid-20th century planner called Thomas Sharp to provide accommodation for the workers in the new forest. In fact, he designed 8 villages, but only 3 were ever built. There were Stonehaugh and Kielder, and another at Burness on the A68, and none of them was ever finished. He was furious, actually. He intended them to have all sorts of services as well as houses, but they were never provided, because the Commission realised that they'd overestimated the number of workers needed. It was all a bit unsatisfactory, and I suspect that there was a lot of disappointment and rural isolation. But in the 1980s the village was tarted up, made much prettier with nice paint jobs, and a wider range of people were encouraged to live here. To be honest, I don't know what it's like as a place to live, but it looks nice, and somebody local has carved some totem poles and put them beside the picnic area at the far end of the village, which gives it a certain sense of place. From the car park there's easy access to beautiful forest walks and to the dramatic mini gorges of the peaty brown Wark's Burn which passes through the village. Now I think it's fair to say that not many 50s council estates have got a better setting.
OK, continue on to Stonehaugh, and when you're there, move on to track 7. Track 7. Keep going straight ahead out of Stonehaugh, and when you reach the T-junction after about half a mile, turn right and follow the road for about 3 miles until you reach a farm called Hetherington. At Hetherington, you need to turn left, following a sign towards Lowstead. You'll need to open a metal gate to get onto this road, but don't forget to close it afterwards.
I love the next few miles. As you leave Stonehaugh, you're only partly in the forest, and there's enough surviving evidence of the landscape that existed before the trees were planted to let you imagine what it used to be. At the T-junction, just beyond the village, is a tiny former schoolroom. It must have been in the middle of nowhere. Remember to turn right at the junction, and then for a while you'll have the forest on one side of you, but pretty soon the forest gets left behind altogether. Every building that you pass has got something interesting that could be said about it. I say every building, but in fact there are only 5 buildings, and most of those are set back from the road. The first farm that you pass is called Rose's Bower, which is an extraordinary name for a farm in Northumberland, where it's much more common to live in places called Foul Bog or Skirl Naked. I didn't make those up, incidentally, but Rose's Bower is supposed to have been a bower or hideaway back in the Middle Ages of a lady called Rosamond, who had a lover from the local Charlton family, and I suppose that that's just about possible. What I like about the place, though, has got nothing to do with roses or anything half so sweet-smelling. Behind the farm there's an old toilet which has been restored by the National Park. I mention this with some pride because back in the 1980s I discovered it and made it a listed toilet. It's an extraordinary object. There's a dramatic gorge behind the farm, and the toilet juts out over it, so that to sit on its seat is to be poised 40 feet above the ground. A draughty and unsettling experience, I suspect, though perhaps not so unsettling as to find yourself innocently walking up the gorge beneath it. It's called the Long Drop, for reasons that should need no explanation. About a mile down the road from Rose's Bower, the next farm that you'll pass is called Craigshield. You'll only just catch a glimpse of it in a minute or two, but it's another place with a very interesting name. Craig just means crag, which is obvious enough, as you'll see when you pass it. The farm nestles beside an outcrop of rock. But the shield part of the name is more unusual. In the past, the farmers of Northumberland practised transhumance, which means that they wintered down in the valleys, but in summer they would come up into the hills to their summer pastures with their flocks, and they would camp out in rough stone huts. The huts were called shielings or shields, and the pastures were called shieling grounds. In 1599, the writer William Camden described the locals as ancient nomads, who from the month of April unto August lie out summering with their cattle in little cottages which they call shields. There are hundreds of shield names in the hills, and Craigshield must have been one of these seasonal pastures. Just after Craigshield, the next farm, 1/4 of a mile off the road on the right, introduces yet another local story. It's called Hornistead, and in front of it, if you look carefully, you'll see the lower walls of a ruined building. This was a bassel, or bassel house, which is a word that you'd better get fixed in your mind, because I intend to bang on about bassels until you're begging for mercy. It's the same word, I suppose, as the French word Bastille, which means a fortified building, and that's what Hornistead is, or was. It was just small, about 30 feet long, 20 feet wide, but it had immensely thick walls and tiny little windows. It was built about 1570, perhaps, when conditions up here in North Tyne had become fantastically insecure. When crime was rife, and cattle thieving and horse thieving, sheep thieving, any sort of thieving had become a way of life. It was built at the time of the Border Reivers, which is another word that I'm going to bang on about. But not just yet, because you need to be alert to a change of direction. So over to Marion.
In a moment, you'll pass a farm called the Ash, which has a remarkably rocky and craggy situation. Just after that, there's a pretty little cottage called Ledgate, and then 1/2 a mile later you'll come to a farm called Hetherington. Immediately after the farm, the road bears right, but on the left there's a gate and road that's signposted towards Lowstead and Linacres. Go through this gate, then close it behind you, and move on to track 8. Track 8. Once you've closed the gate at Hetherington, follow the road for about a mile to a T-junction. and then turn left following the signs to Kielder and Bellingham. Continue on until you come to another T-junction at the foot of a very long hill where there's a farm which is called Dunterley Farm, and another sign pointing towards Kielder. Dunterley will mark the end of Track 8. You'll be sharing the first mile or so of this section of the road until the first T-junction with the Pennine Way, the great long-distance pathway, and also with the National Cycle Byway, so you'll need to be aware of the possibility of pedestrians and cyclists.
Lowstead, the name on the signpost by the gate you've just come through, is a farm off to the left which you can't see unless you're prepared to abandon your car and take instead to the Pennine Way, the great long-distance footpath which passes through its farmyard. I mention it, though, because it is yet another bassel. I lie. It's actually two bassels joined together, end to end. One's a normal bassel, about 30 to 40 feet long, about the same length as the ruin that we passed at Hornistead a few moments ago, but the other is shorter. It's about half the length, and it seems to have been built on a little bit later, like a sort of granny bassel built next door to the main house. Remember that you have to turn left at the T-junction, always following the signs for the National Cycle Byway. Right now, you've probably noticed that since leaving Simonburn 8 or 9 miles ago, we haven't seen a lot of houses, and to be honest, there won't be many in the next 5 or 6 miles either. So you might think, looking at how few houses there are around here, and how far apart they are, that it would be a rather isolated place to live. But you would be wrong. Or rang, as they might pronounce it in a northeastern dialect, which reminds me of the Geordie boy who is offered a cake by his gran. She says, "OK, Geordie, would you like a doughnut or a meringue?" "No, Granny," says, "you're not rang, you're reet. I'll have a doughnut." Now, if you understood that, you should be very proud of yourself. Mind, if you laughed, you should probably be a bit worried. But you would be wrong, or rang, to think that life is isolated up here. When I was thinking about this route, I drove around it with my colleague Leslie, who's lived in North Tyne for years. Well, she just knew everybody and where they lived and what they did. We passed a girl on horseback. She says, "Oh, there's John's daughter. Hey, they've been doing very well with their horses." And we saw a woman in a cottage in the middle of absolutely nowhere, and Leslie said, "Oh, there's so-and-so. She's been in our gardening group for years." A completely isolated cottage gave rise to, "Hey, that's where Thingy lives. Do you know her? She does those lovely children's books with sheep and sheepdogs. Do you know them?" She knew everybody and who their grannies were. I've seen it myself too. When I was a listed building man, I called in at one of the most remote of all the houses in the area, back in the forest, way beyond Stonehaugh. I was quite nervous, actually. I thought Rumpelstiltskin might live there, or a wicked witch or something. But when I got there, the kitchen was full of women, having coffee and laughing a lot. One of them had even driven over the border from Cumberland by tractor to get there. It's clear that this is not a remote place at all. It's close and neighbourly, probably more so than the sort of towny streets that most of us live in. Having said all of that, you can't get away from the fact that there aren't many people up here, but that there are a lot of sheep. I thought I might say something about sheep, since this is sheep country, and you'll already have met lots and lots of them. But there is a quiet irony in my telling you about sheep, since I'm one of the few people to have run away from them in fear. I was playing cricket with some chums on a picnic, when a line of sheep appeared on the ridge on a hill alongside of us. They had the air of Indians waiting to attack a wagon train, and indeed they suddenly started to charge down the hill towards us. We laughed lightly for a moment or two, but then, as the onslaught got closer, we broke ranks and fled. There are probably granny sheep still passing on this heroic tale to their descendants, the day that the humans ran. Well, apart from being fierce sometimes, sheep have always impressed me in other ways, especially upland sheep. They're incredibly independent, first of all, and hardy. They live on the hills, and they must be the only animals left which never get factory farmed. And they can be amazingly agile too. You see them bounding over streams and leaping over high stone walls. And they're territorial. When they're born, they're imprinted onto a particular piece of hillside. It's known as being hefted here, and once a sheep has been hefted, it'll always return to its own piece of hillside, if it's been chased or something, which is brilliant because it means that on the open fells farmers don't lose their sheep, and it means that they can always keep a record of who's who in the sheep world. If you keep all of the offspring of a particular ram on the same hillside, then there's no danger of trying to mate them with their own father in the future. It's all very, very clever. There are lots of different breeds. There are Northumberland blackface, which I'm reliably informed are the ones with the black faces, and there are crosses, blackfaces, crossed with Cheviot sheep, for example, and the crosses tend to be worth more than the pure bred. It can get very confusing, this, so I want you to follow very carefully, because some of the crosses create mules. Mules. Mules are crosses between lowland sheep and upland varieties, and they tend to be hardy as well as producing good meat. And of course, it's not just mules. Sheep can be hogs too. What is the world coming to? Sheep, mules, hogs? So confusing. Hogs are sheep up to a year old that haven't yet been sheared. The farms are nearly all big. An average English farm is supposed to be about 140 acres or 57 hectares. Well, Rose's Bower that you passed before is 230 acres, almost twice the national average, and some around here are huge. One I know is 2,500 acres, supports over 2,000 sheep. Well, they have to be big, of course, because the land is rough and cold. The grass stops growing in October and the lambs aren't all that valuable. At 50 or 60 quid a head, nobody's going to make a fortune. But at least it all happens in a beautiful place, and that must be some sort of compensation. Well, I hope it is anyway. I'm sort of assuming that either now or pretty soon you'll be on wide open moorland and climbing a long, long hill. It's called Dunterley Fell, and when you finally get to the top of it, the view becomes pretty massive. Below you will be the town of Bellingham, where you're ultimately headed. But not yet. We're going to show you Bellingham and then whip it away from you as we force you to head deeper into the hills. At the bottom of Dunterley Fell, right at the bottom of the hill, is Dunterley Farm, which doubles as a farm shop, specialising in local meat. So you could, if you wanted, buy the chums of the sheep that you've just been driving past.
Keep going till you reach the T-junction at Dunterley Farm. At the junction, turn left towards Kielder. Track 9. When you've turned left towards Kielder, keep going straight on till you pass a farm called Snabdaugh. You'll then cross a humpbacked bridge and turn right before arriving at the main road towards Kielder Water.
This is quite a wild drive, so on the whole you won't see much in the way of gentle landscape or sophisticated architecture. But in a few moments' time that'll change for a while. First of all, you'll find yourself surrounded by lush trees, not conifers like you drove through back in the forest, but grand, mature, broadleaf trees. Shortly after that you'll be right back down beside the river North Tyne, and in about a mile's time you'll find yourself crossing pretty pastoral parkland, and you'll see a nice late Georgian mansion called Heslyside. I say late Georgian. It's got older, early Georgian stuff down one side, but the front that you'll see from the road dates from 1796. You'll get a nice glimpse through the pretty Victorian cast-iron gateway up to the present entrance. And that side of the building was redone in the 1860s by an architect called Ignatius Bonamy, which I think is rather a splendid name. Heslyside was, well, it still is, the home of the Charlton family, and it contains one iconic object, which is known as the Charlton Spur. It's an old iron spur such as a horse rider might wear, and it rests on a dish. The story goes that in the old days, the 16th century probably, the Mr. Charlton of the day would sit down expecting his tea, and his wife would emerge instead with the dish and the spur and put it down in front of him. Her message was clear. There's nothing in the larder, pet, so get on your horse and go and steal some cattle. I've been lucky enough to see this spur, but for those of you who never get the opportunity, there is a marvellous painting of the scene in the central hall of the National Trust property at Wallington. The Charlton family, you see, were border reivers. The word reeve means to take away forcibly, to steal. It's an archaic word, but we still use it in some contexts. So if you get bereaved, you've had a life taken away from you forcibly and painfully. Well, the border reivers took things away from people forcibly. They existed, the border reivers existed, because of the strangely savage history of this region. The border between England and Scotland was finally established as early as 1139, after the Battle of the Standard. But that didn't mean that there wasn't trouble between the two countries. Good gracious, no. Edward I started a war against the Scots in 1286, and it sort of more or less continued off and on for the next 300 years. For the first couple of hundred years, the 13 and 1400s, there were absolutely endless invasions and counter-invasions. 90% of the job applications in those days put down pillaging as a key skill, and you can't have that sort of situation without it taking its toll on the native population, and life clearly became pretty intolerable up here. In 1315, the area exactly where you are now was recorded as being worth nothing, because it had just been laid waste and destroyed by the Scots. A century later, in 1435, an Italian called Aeneas Sylvius, who went on to become Pope Pius II, one of the greatest Renaissance popes, came through the Cheviots on his way to Edinburgh, and he described the area as uninhabitable, horrible, and uncultivated. In circumstances like that, people have to find ways of coping, and what they did up here was to organise themselves into clans, except that they weren't called clans, but surnames. Over the whole border area on the Scottish side as well as the English side, there were lots of different surnames. There were Armstrongs and Elliots, Fosters. But in the North Tyne area, the four key surnames were the Dodds, the Milburns, the Robsons, and most importantly, the Charltons. They're all still here. A glance in the telephone directory or school registers would quickly reveal that the old surnames haven't gone away. They're just rather less likely to go reiving and pillaging than they were. Not only are the families still here, but their houses are too. In the 16th century, they built themselves fortified vassal houses, as I said before at Hornistead. I've only mentioned a couple so far, but they're all over the place. Whole houses or ruined fragments or bits of them built into later houses. They're far from obvious because they were very plain buildings, but at the end of this track, in about a mile's time, you'll be approaching one of the best examples of them all. It's called Snabdaugh, and it's a farmhouse now. You'll see it standing all alone on the left-hand side of the road. It looks superficially like an ordinary house. It's in 3 sections, lower wings on either side and a higher bit in the middle. The lower bits on each side were added in the 19th century, but the higher middle section is the basel. If you look carefully, you can tell it's a basel by the scale and the roughness of the masonry and the odd blocked-up little windows. What you can't tell from outside is that the walls are almost 2 metres or over 5 feet thick, or that underneath the roof slates there's a stone roof, a steeply pointed stone roof 2 floors above the ground. The whole building is like a massively strong stone tent 3 stories high. It dates from sometime late in the 1500s, and you'll never see anything else like it anywhere in England.
After Snabdaugh, it's almost a mile to the main road. Cross the humpback bridge, bear right, and then at the main road, turn left and head for Kielder water. Switch off or pause now and move on to track 10 when you're on the main road. Track 10.
You're heading for Kielder water now, which is about 6 miles up the road from here, and you're also back in North Tyne proper. I've burbled on about the valley's warlike past enough recently, so I'm not going to say a lot more, but I will add that however peaceful it all looks today, the uneasy past is all around you, if you had the time to explore. In the hills off to your left are the ruins of Dally Castle. On the opposite side of the valley, the fragmentary remains of Tarset Castle. Between here and Kielder you'll pass several complete bastles, and many of the other farms that you'll see on the valley sides include bits of basal stonework. But since those big, bad, bastly castly days, so much has changed. It has settled down. The first Duke of Northumberland might have been surprised at the wildness of his tenants when he arrived in the 1700s, but it wasn't long before the valley began to settle down, to become less isolated. At the end of the 18th century, coal was discovered up here, and for over 100 years the head of the valley became an industrial area. A toll road was built to improve access. The humpback bridge that you just crossed after Snabdaugh was one of the toll bridges, built in 1830 by the Swinburne family, who owned the rights to much of the coal. The engineer who planned the road was the famous Scottish engineer Thomas Telford. Later in the 19th century, a railway was added to export the coal even more efficiently. Since 1930, as I was saying a while ago, the Forestry Commission has been transforming the landscape, and most recently there's been the Kielder Reservoir, one of the largest man-made lakes in Europe, built to supply the northeast with water into the foreseeable future. Now, I don't know what the weather's like while you're travelling today, but the slightly discouraging fact is that Kielder was built because it rains a lot up here, so there would always be a pretty secure supply of water to keep the reservoir full. It was also built here because the population was small in the upper part of the valley, so the project could go ahead without uprooting too many people. Displacing anybody is distressing, but it turned out to be less destructive here than in any of the alternative possible sites. There is a certain irony that it was built at all, given that its role was to supply the water-hungry chemical and steel industries of Teesside, most of which have now disappeared. But it was built, begun in 1975, opened in 1982, and it continues to ensure that the North East has the most secure water supply in the country. It does more than that, though. It has become an extraordinary recreation area. Just think of a thing that you can do with your leisure time, and you'll find that you can do it at Kielder. There's bike riding and horse riding, canoeing, walking, bird watching, astronomy, craft classes. There's art all over the place and picnic areas. You can visit the salmon hatchery or go fell running. You can sail on the lake or take lake excursions on the ferry. There are adventure playgrounds and unspoilt forest walks. There are visitor centres and food, coffee shops and toilets. I think that's still a leisure activity. Half the surviving red squirrels in England live around Kielder, and there are ospreys and otters. There are roe deer and tigers. Well, I made up the bit about tigers, but it really has become a remarkable place. And it's beautiful too. Water and trees and hills always make for a beautiful combination, and there are thousands of ways to explore all three. The new attitude towards access and biodiversity that the Forestry Commission has shown recently has its ultimate expression here, and the same ideals are being pursued by all of the partners. And it's good. It really is good. It's not like anywhere else in Northumberland, and certainly not like the sort of wild emptiness that you've been experiencing so far on this drive, but it is good. There's far too much for me to tell you which bits to visit, and far too much for you to see in a bit of one day. So perhaps you'd like to have a first potter, suss out a couple of places for starters, and plan another visit in the future.
You can now go and enjoy as many of the manifold delights of Kielder water as you want. We'd suggest that you start off by calling in at the visitor centre at Stonehaugh, which provides most of the facilities that John mentioned, as well as an information centre that will tell you about other possibilities. When you're ready to leave Kielder, turn back on this road and find the turn-off to the village of Falstone. Track 11. Leave Kielder on the same road that brought you here. About a mile south of the Stonehaugh Visitor Centre, turn left into the village of Falstone. You perhaps need to be warned that the road beyond Falstone is a gated road. There are as many as 5 gates that you might need to open and close again.
You'll arrive at Falstone over yet another toll bridge. Quite a big one this time, which was built in 1843 as part of an improvement to the toll road up the valley. Beyond the bridge, the house beside the church on the right-hand side of the road is yet another Bassal house, or at least half of it is. It was doubled in length in the 18th century, but your new expertise in Bassal masonry should allow you to identify the older bits. It has an extraordinary door inside which you won't be able to see, but which is dated 1602 and has a wildly carved inscription, made up, it seems, of the first 10 letters of the alphabet minus the letter L, which possibly says something about the level of literacy in the valley at that time. The churchyard contains some rather wild carving too. There are a number of very interesting 18th century gravestones, including one in which a little girl dances hand in hand with death while waving a posy of flowers in the air. It's just south of the church door, and it's very strange. You could pause in Falstone if you wanted to. The tea room or the pub would be reasons to do so. Both of them have been known to satisfy this correspondent. A few years ago Northumberland was a culinary desert, but nowadays cafes and tea shoppies leap out at you round every corner. It's one of the great developments of rural life. The Falstone tea shop was converted out of the old village school by the National Park Authority. One of the things that makes it worthy of your support is that it runs, at least partly, on renewable energy.
If you decide to stop at Falstone, pause or switch off now and turn back on to track 12 when you're ready to leave. Alternatively, continue straight on through the village and on to the next track. Track 12. Take the road between the tea room and the pub and continue till you reach the T-junction at Lanehead in about 5 miles' time. You need to know that this is a gated road. The gates aren't always closed, but there are 5 of them, and it's important that you always leave them the way you find them. Open if they're open, and closed if they're closed.
So you can concentrate on the gates. I'm not going to talk for very long in this bit. It's a lovely road, though, out into a quiet and forgotten landscape. Everything that you've driven through since Simonburn used to be part of Simonburn parish. It was called the Great Parish, and it was the largest in England. It stretched from the Roman wall to the Scottish border, and it included the area where you are now. The whole parish once belonged to a man called the Earl of Derwentwater, who was executed for taking part in the 1715 Jacobite rebellion, and his property was handed over to the Royal Navy of all people. In fact, it was given to Greenwich Hospital, which has always been the great naval charity. 100 years later, after the Napoleonic Wars, the Navy was trying to downsize, so it came up with a cunning wheeze to get rid of a few redundant chaplains. They split Simonburn parish up and built a pile of new churches. One of them was here at Falstone, which is a parish on its own now, but used to be just a chapel belonging to Simonburn. They then sent redundant padres up here to become vicars. It wasn't entirely successful. These men had been used to the cut and thrust of navy ships, or the life and bustle of barracks in Portsmouth and Plymouth, and understandably they found it difficult to transfer to the wilds of North Tyne, which might be a nice place, but undoubtedly lacks life and bustle. One vicar's wife was described as shuddering with horror as she recalled the icy blasts and the isolation that they'd suffered during the previous winter, and 2 of the vicars at least went mad under the strain. One visitor wrote, "Mr. Rennell, the rector, is in confinement as a lunatic in Newcastle. Mr. Rennell, as far as I can hear, was an orderly and a temperate man, which Mr. Burden, his fellow sufferer from the neighbouring parish, certainly was not." That was back in 1832, but you have to wonder if there's something in the water, because there are stories of one of the recent vicars in the valley who used to do his gardening in the nude. I'm sure you'll see no naked vicars, but you will see the remains of the Border Counties Railway, which went from Hexham to join the main line to Scotland at Riccarton Junction. You passed one of its stations when you crossed the Tyne at Chollerford early in this trip. It was begun in the 1850s and finally opened as far as Kielder in 1862. It must have been a beautiful trip, but there weren't enough people to make it a success. You would think that would have been obvious. The industries it was meant to support were all short-lived too, so it was one of the first rural lines in the country to close down. The trains had been withdrawn by 1955, and the track lifted a few years later. There's an amazing amount left, though. Embankments and cuttings, cattle arches, bridges. Thornyburn Station, which you'll come to soon, is one of my favourite railway relics. 55 years after it closed down, there's still a single-storey railway cottage, a lineman's hut in weathered wood which looks like a refugee from a ghost town in the American West, and a set of level crossing gates, still complete, still fully working, waiting for the down train from Kielder, which will never come.
So remember to leave any gates just as you found them, and keep on going until you get to the T-junction at Lanehead, where you'll turn left for one final loop across some of Northumberland's wildest moors. Track 13. Turn left and initially follow the signs to Jedburgh, but after about half a mile, ignore the Jedburgh turn-off and continue on through Greenhoff, following the brown tourist signs to Black Middens Basel.
This short drive takes you first through the village of Greenhoff, which is a charming pub called the Hollybush, if pubs are your thing. But beyond Greenhoff, it will take you out into the land of the Border Reivers, and it will give you the chance to spot 3 more of the Basel houses that they lived in. 3. Now there's a treat. 2 of them are at the hamlet of Gatehouse, about a glorious moorland mile north of Greenhoff, and 1 is at Black Middens, a bit further on. Some of the stories about the Border Reivers who lived in these Basels are amazing. One time, according to Barbara Charlton, who wrote a great book about Upper Tynedale, a group of men from the Noble family stole a flock of sheep from the Armstrongs across the border in Scotland. But when they got home, they discovered that the sheep were infected with the scab. So they rode back to Scotland, hanged 7 people, and left a note telling the Armstrongs to make sure that their sheep weren't scabby in the future. The raids weren't necessarily small-scale either. In 1579, the Armstrongs attacked exactly where you are now, Thornyburn and Greenhoff, with 400 men. They stole 80 cattle and 1,000 sheep. They came back in 1584, burned 60 houses and killed 10 people before driving off vast quantities of stock. The violence didn't even end when England and Scotland had become one country in 1603. At the very end of the 1600s, Barty Milburn, whose Basel was just beyond Black Middens, chased 2 Scotsmen who'd stolen some of his sheep, and in the fight that followed, he sliced the head off one of the Scotsmen. Barty said that the heed span along the heather like an onion. How touching. In a mile or so you'll come to the isolated hamlet that I mentioned, which is called Gatehouse, and among the cluster of more recent houses, 2 Basel houses, one on either side of the road, will really stand out when you get close to them. There's been so much happening on this supposedly isolated countryside drive that I still haven't had the chance to really explain what Basels were. They were fortified, thick walls, quite small, you know all that. But the thing that makes them unique in this country is that they were shared between animals and people. They were 2 stories high. The ground floor was for cattle, the first floor for people. For extra protection, the ground floor had an immensely strong door, and there was no staircase to the upper floor. In fact, there was no connection between the floors at all. There was a doorway on the upper floor which led to the room where the people lived, but it could only be reached by a ladder, which could be pulled up after you if there was any sign of trouble. The Basel on the right, the north side of the road at Gatehouse, is an almost perfect example. The only change that's occurred is that it's had its original ladder replaced with a set of stone steps to the first floor doorway, but otherwise it's almost entirely unaltered. Inside, the ground floor has got an amazing ceiling made up of massive, twisty timbers. It's like giants would have made, or trolls. Lots of the bastles have got stone vaulted ground floors, but this one is at least as impressive. The walls themselves, the outer walls, are amazing too. They're built of massive blocks of random stone. About a mile or so beyond Gatehouse, Black Middens has been much more altered, and lacks some of the raw power of the Gatehouse Bastle. But since it belongs to English heritage, it's the only one that you can actually get a proper look at. And anyway, it's built in a gorgeous spot. So, wend your way towards Gatehouse and towards Black Middens, and watch out for spinning heeds.
There's a little car park at Black Middens and a walk of about 100 metres up to the Bastle. When you've finished there, you'll need to set off back the way you arrived. Track 14. Go back the way you've come, but just after Gatehouse, ignore the turn off towards Greenhoff and continue straight ahead, following signs to High Green. Keep going until you reach the main road, the A68.
So, 2 more tracks, and the point of them is quite simple. Rather than just fizzle out, I wanted you to end this drive by going over the wildest of all the wild moors. In my humble opinion, one of the most beautiful roads anywhere. It's quite a long road, though. It's 7 miles from Black Middens to the A68, so I'm not going to keep on rabbiting the whole way. You'll have plenty of peace to just enjoy the view, and to ensure that blissful silence, I'm going to tell you now about things that you won't actually pass until 2 or 3 miles later on. For ages now, you've been in a parish called Tarset, which covers a huge area, but only has a total population of about 300. If, instead of turning back, we'd continued on beyond Black Middens to the very edge of the forest, we'd have come to a farm called Combe, and the remarkable thing about Combe is that nowadays it's an events and conference centre. I think that's remarkable for 2 reasons. First of all, that all of the wildness and violence from the past should have so completely disappeared, and secondly, that this parish, the parish of Tarset where we are now, with its total population of about 300, should have not only a conference centre, but also a pub and a school and a village hall. It's got a community website too, and a blogging community, whatever that might be. According to my reckoning, those 300 inhabitants also support 24 separate clubs and organisations, from indoor bowls to clay pigeon shooting, from mother and toddler groups to over 50s clubs. There aren't any reivers anymore. Well, except the song reivers, of course, the local choir who meet on Monday mornings in the village hall. If Barty Milburn still lived up here, he wouldn't have any time for slicing heeds anymore. He'd be on the village hall committee, and he'd be too busy playing indoor bowls. And there's one other organisation that deserves a mention. On the wildest of the wild fells up ahead of you, you'll pass it in a few minutes' time, there's a house that would seem more at home in the poshest suburbs of Edinburgh. It's called High Green Manor, and it was built in Scottish baronial style in 1894 for a Durham mine owner called William Bell. The Bells became the Morrison Bells, and that family still owns the house, only now they've turned it into an active and vibrant arts centre. I know I say this too often, but I love this place. I love the juxtaposition of the refined suburban house with the wild landscape all around. Shortly after High Green Manor, you need to bear right at a T-junction, and shortly after that, at the very top of the hill, you cross the line of the Pennine Way, almost the end of its 256 miles, and then you begin to drop down into Redesdale, the valley of the River Reed, which is a tributary of the Tyne. Redesdale was a valley just as wild as Tynedale back in the 16th century, and for a time the men of these 2 valleys had such a terrible reputation that it was against the law for any Newcastle craftsman to employ one of them as an apprentice. It was even illegal for a Redesdale man to remain within the walls of the city after curfew. Well, they've calmed down a bit since then, though, you will be relieved to hear. Ahead of you, after you cross the ridge into Redesdale, you'll see rows and rows of hills, across the valley of the Coquet and up into the heart of the Cheviot Hills. The A68 below you is one of the main roads into Scotland. It follows the line of Deer Street, the ancient Roman road that went from York via Corbridge up to Edinburgh. What on earth must the Romans have thought of this place 2,000 years ago?
Remember to turn right at the junction after High Green Manor and continue on until you reach the A68 and turn right. Move on to the final track when you're on the A68 heading south. Track 15. Finally, you have a choice. If you've travelled enough, you could just follow the A68 south towards the military road and then on to Corbridge. If you're game for one more diversion, turn next right onto the B6320, which will take you to Bellingham, and then on, past Simonburn, to Chollerford. Both are splendid roads. So, straight on home via the A68, or first right, onto the B6320 via Bellingham.
Bellingham has a number of things which might draw you towards it, not least of which is a heritage centre which explores all of the themes that I've been going on about in much finer detail than I can aspire to. It explores the world of the Reivers and the border wars. It tells the story of hill farms and the arrival of the Border Counties Railway. It tells about other things too, because for a while Bellingham was an industrial centre. If you have chosen to follow the B6320 towards Bellingham, you should be able to spot some of the surviving evidence of those days in a couple of miles' time. Once you've crossed the ridge and you're beginning the long descent down towards the town, you'll see that the moors on both sides of the road were the centre of small-scale coal mining. There are small spoil heaps and the low circular depressions that provide evidence of abandoned shallow bell pits, where the miners sank a shaft and then just dug out sideways in a sort of bell shape until the roof became unstable, and then they would abandon the mine and sink another shaft a bit further along. It sounds very scary to me. As well as coal, there was iron here. The valley of the Hareshaw Burn off to your left as you drive down towards the town was a rich source of iron ore for a while in the early 19th century, and part of the iron for Tyneside's great high-level bridge came from here. That industry failed because of isolation before the railway had a chance to arrive and save it, but it's left its mark in the town. There are a few rows of mine workers' cottages, and the town is rich in decorative Victorian ironwork, pretty railings and cresting on roofs and porches. You start spotting it and you'll see it everywhere. But the final reason for ending up in Bellingham is that it has a church, which is an archetypal Northumbrian experience. It's not a church which is full of blissful beauties, to be honest, but it is a church that you really ought to see for a whole host of reasons. First of all, it's dedicated to St Cuthbert, and at the foot of a flight of stone steps behind the church there's a spring called St Cuthbert's Well. It has a rather worn and picturesque 18th century stone cover, but its situation, as well as its name, ties it pretty firmly to the origins of the church. It's in a classic situation for a preaching spot, where early missionaries in Anglo-Saxon times would use what may well have been a much more ancient holy well as a place to convert people to Christianity. It is a lovely, quiet and rather spiritual place. But the church is also interesting for quite different reasons. Seen from the outside, it has a remarkable stone roof, thick and strong and powerful. And inside, the ceilings of the nave and the south chapel are powerfully vaulted in stone. It's a fortified church, in fact, one of quite a number of fortified churches in Northumberland, where even the church wasn't safe from attack. Actually, North Tyne churches had a bit of an image problem during the border troubles. In 1498, Bishop Fox of Durham wrote, "The priests of that country are most evil. They keep their concubines, they're ignorant almost entirely of letters, some are not ordained at all, but merely counterfoils of priests, they dare to celebrate the holy sacrifice in profane and ruined places, with vestments torn and ragged and most filthy, unworthy of divine worship." Cardinal Wolsey went one stage further. In 1525 he placed the whole district under an interdict, which meant that it wasn't possible to take mass or get married or have burial service. Didn't really bother the locals, though. Hector Charlton came to St Cuthbert's, stole the communion bread and wine, and carried out the service himself back at home. It's amazing stuff, this, isn't it? But the final interesting part of it is that the fortification of the church, the vaulted ceilings, that wasn't done until 1609, 6 years after the union of the crowns had supposedly brought the troubles to an end. I suppose 300 years of war takes more than a new government to bring it to an end. And there's one final thing which reinforces exactly that point. In the churchyard, just north of the church, there's a gravestone lying flat on the ground. It's actually a 13th century grave cover, but it's known as the Long Pack. The story is that in 1723, Colonel Ridley from Lee Hall, a house a couple of miles south of Bellingham, went to London with his family, leaving the house in the care of the servants. A pedlar arrived, bearing a heavy pack and begging for a night's lodging. He was refused, but he was given permission to leave his pack overnight so that it could be collected in the morning. Later that night, one of the servants was convinced that she saw the parcel move, so another one fired a blunderbuss into it. There were terrible groans, and the parcel writhed and blood poured out of it. It was unwrapped, and a dying man was found inside, with a silver whistle around his neck. It was clear that his job was to get inside the house and summon his confederates with the whistle when the coast was clear. So the servants summoned help from armed neighbours. They lay in wait, and they blew the whistle. The robbers emerged and were gunned down, and 4 were killed, but their bodies were secreted away by the gang, and the identity of the man in the long pack was never discovered. 1723, eh? And you thought that Britain's streets weren't safe nowadays.
When you've finished in Bellingham, we suggest that you continue south on the main road, still the B6320, following signs towards Hexham. We hope you've enjoyed the day and that you'll find opportunities to come back in the future and explore this beautiful area in even more depth.